This is a CBC podcast.
Tanse, Anine, Boozhoo, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna, dear child. Well, you may have seen it on the news. Last week, Manitoba was hit with a massive snowstorm. High winds and heavy snow took out power lines, blew tree limbs everywhere, and people were slipping and sliding all over the place, including me, who immediately upon stepping outside sprained my ankle. So I figured this is the perfect time to put my feet up and read a good book, or several, and of course, share them with you. Today on Unreserved, join me and some friends for some Indigenous books to curl up with. This week, a number of our favorite authors got together in Calgary for WordFest. So we grabbed a mic and headed out to find out what they're reading.
Hi, I'm Cherie Demeline, and I'm from the Georgian Bay Métis community. My latest book is Empire of Wild, and it's about a lot of things. It's about loss and love, and it's about the creature that haunts my community, the rougarou. One book that I absolutely think that everyone should have on their shelves, in their home, in their office, it should be in schools, is Half-Breed by Maria Campbell. Half-Breed is Maria's memoir, and it's a story about growing up in the road allowance, and her struggles and her triumphs and her challenges and the ways in which she held all of us as a community. She protected the language, and she came back home. And the good news is that it's being reissued, so we get the new edition of Grandmother Maria's book this November.
That was author Cherie Demeline sharing a book pick for Half-Breed by Maria Campbell. Stay with us. We'll have more authors recommending books to add to your library over the course of the show. You can also find the Unreserved Fall Book Pick list on our website, cbc.ca/unreserved.
Sometimes, in between slumber and consciousness, I sleepwalk. My mind not yet aware, I shuffle out the front door. The crisp, open air and night sky still call me. At night, in between slumber and consciousness, I sleepwalk. My soul not yet aware that my wanderings are over, and I have a home.
He is a leading Métis history scholar and a passionate voice for the homeless. His work has earned him a Vanier and a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation scholarship, as well as a Governor General's Academic Medal. But Jesse Thistle has his own story. It's a personal and painful one of a little boy searching for home. His memoir, From the Ashes, has been on bestseller lists across the country pretty much since its release, and I'm happy to welcome him back on the show. Jesse, welcome.
Hi.
Your book is amazing. It's so powerful and sweet and honest and raw and all of those things that make a good book. Why did you want to write this very intimate personal memoir?
Originally, I didn't want to write it, so it happened by accident. I collected what are called 4 steps from rehab, and I did that all the way through university after I found my way to school. And I graduated and won all these major awards, and it caught the attention of the Toronto Star, and then they came and did a story on my life and the awards, and that caught the attention of a lady named Adria at Simon & Schuster, who asked me if I wanted to write a book about my life, and she asked me if I had written anything about my life, and I sent her all these 4 steps that I had compiled in a blog, and they offered me a major book contract. So really, the book happened by accident, and I really didn't expect anybody to read my 4 steps. They were for me. Yeah.
And so when did you know you wanted to share this story on a larger platform?
Well, it has to do with my academic work as a homeless scholar of Indigenous homelessness. And I would go around and write all these academic papers, and I would mix in my personal story with what I was presenting about like the different dimensions of Indigenous homelessness. And it really connected with people, and it was something that they didn't know that was kind of second knowledge to me because I had lived it. And so I got to thinking that maybe more people would be interested in hearing my personal story rather than just my academic stuff. And when I looked at it through that lens, I realized that my story is kind of bigger than me, and it needed to be shared, and I had to do it fearlessly.
Memoirs are really difficult to write. It means remembering and reliving painful experiences from your life. Yet you do so with such clarity and honesty. How did you approach the research for your book?
Well, from rehab, I collected all the different things that I needed to kind of archive my life. So I was going to get my GED, so I had to go back and get school records. And I had those on hand, and I saved them and put them away. I had to get court records for my fees, so I put that away. And it's really an archive of my life. And those documents served me well because I could pinpoint, okay, this is when I got arrested. And it was actually different than what I remembered. And so through the reconstruction of these documents that I just collected to better my life, I could see in clarity the person that I was. And also I was seeing a therapist while I was writing the book, and she kind of unearthed a lot of memories that I really didn't even know were there, or she helped clarify what actually happened. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Now, From the Ashes is divided into two major parts. The first, your childhood, moving from your parents to your grandparents and what that life was like. And then the second part is about your life on the street and your struggles to get off the streets. But the book doesn't really have chapters per se. Instead, it's like these snippets of memories and of events, a page, a paragraph, a poem. Why did you write the book that way?
Because we live in the age of Instagram, and people have the attention of fruit flies. And
That's not true. Wait, what did you say? No, I'm kidding.
It's actually a narrative technique to keep the pace of the book going, because people always want to read the next chapter. And when they're reading, they say, oh, I can just read another chapter. It's only a couple pages. And by the time you get to the next chapter, it's so good that you go to the next chapter. And also, the way that the stories were written came from blog posts. So they were written in these short snippets. I actually posted a lot of these on my Facebook years ago.
Did I read somewhere that this is how you remembered your life, in these sort of small frames of memory?
Exactly. So I suffer from complex PTSD, and so when engaging with memories, I can only stay in the moment for a short period of time before I start to get injured by what happened or what I did to other people, right? I was no saint. And that comes out in short fragments of memory, and that's how, traumatic memory works. And I did that all the way through the whole book, really quick in and outs of certain memories that happened to me.
What has it been like having to relive those memories as you promote this book?
Oh, it's been tough. I've been having to go to the spa every week with my wife. She always makes sure that I'm okay. She does daily, we sit down and we have a debriefing. My cat is there that I play with, and I always make sure that I go out into nature at least once or twice a week to really decompress from talking about all this. But I also have to remember that ultimately I'm sharing my story to help other people. And so when I keep that in mind, it kind of makes it worth it, and I can endure sharing as deeply as I do.
You've had to really relearn a lot of really basic things with the help of your wife, Lucy. What are some of the things that she's taught you?
Well, I was functionally illiterate when I was on the streets and in and out of the justice system, and I was taking my GED when I was in rehab right before I got back into her life. And when I got out, she always encouraged me to go to school, and she was a former editor in Spain. And so anything that I wrote when I got to university, she would check it over and reteach me grammar, basic grammar, how to write a sentence, how to keep a point and write with clarity. She taught me that early on, and she continues to do that now. She also taught me how to access things like healthcare and she taught me how to drive. It was a difficult process. I don't know if it was safe for both of us, but she was right there and got her mom's car and helped me take my driver's test in her mom's Jeep. And so she did things like that all the way through, and there's thousands of them.
Now, this book is already popping up on school reading lists and book clubs, and the reviews have been overwhelmingly positive. Why do you think it has touched so many people?
because I just shared openly, like it was, again, like the fourth steps were something I never expected really other people to read, and they were for me to heal. And I just shared openly, and I just, said, well, if, it connects, it does. If it doesn't, I can't do anything about that either. It's a piece of art now, and people are going to appreciate it the way they have. And so I just let go. And I really, really let go. And now I think in that honesty, people see themselves and they see other people and their families and different institutions that they've interacted with are similar to my experience because I just put it out there, And with that, there's a real connection, and the response has been overwhelming, I must admit, but I'm glad that it's found its mark.
And does this surprise you that so many people are connecting with this book?
Yeah, I really thought maybe 3 people would read it.
You, Lucy, and...
and you.
And me.
Yeah, I can't believe it. It's like it's now in Australia. We've got people in Algiers contacted us this morning, and like people all over Canada have connected with it, and it's just really found a home with different people that I didn't think would appreciate it. Like there's a lot of people who connect with the adoption angle or the addiction angle or the incarceration or the homelessness or the relearning everything in school. I didn't foresee any of that. And so all these different fragments of society are coming together and relating to the book.
If there is one thing that you hope readers learn from this memoir, what would it be?
That love is home. That's what I want people to know.
Well, now you've just made me cry 51 times. Thank you so much, Jesse.
Thank you for having me.
For this and that book.
Oh, thanks.
Jesse Thistle is Métis Cree from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and the author of From the Ashes. Still ahead, processing grief through writing.
When I really came to the realization that I should write this all down, I was reading Harry Potter, as you do. And it was in the 5th book, and Harry experiences loss in a really intense way in that book. I was reading it, and it's like my grief was written on that page in somebody else's words, and it just stood out to me in such a way that I could just reached out and it grabbed me. Writing became this way to let those feelings leave my body.
In just a few minutes, author Karen McBride on what inspired her debut novel, Crow Winter. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today on the show, we're helping you build your book list for the fall and winter months. If you want a list of all the books we've been talking about on the show today, head to our website at cbc.ca/unreserved. Still ahead, remember the Hardy Boys? Well, meet the Mighty Muskrats.
The Mighty Muskrats are 4 cousins who basically go around the reserve. Their uncle is a local band constable, and their grandpa is a respected elder in the community. And so they hear about a lot of the gossip that's going on. And like any community, things happen. And the Mighty Muskrats are always there to get to the bottom of the case.
Author Michael Hutchinson on 4 mystery-solving cousins from Windy Lake First Nation. I'll chat with him about his Mighty Muskrat series in just a few minutes. But first, another book pick from one of our favorite authors. Let's head back to WordFest in Calgary to get another book recommendation.
Hi, everybody. Dante, Sagyamasi. My name is Richard Van Camp, and I'm Tlicho Dene from Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. My latest book is Moccasin Square Gardens, and it's very funny because I make fun of everybody and everything, including myself. The book I want everyone to read is The Moon of Crusted Snow by Wabgishig Rice. It's published by ECW, and the reason I want you to read it is because it is the great what-if novel. It starts with a small Ojibwe community. It is isolated, and they lose cell service. And then a couple of days later, they lose power. Nobody knows what's happening in southern Canada. It's a very short novel, but it's a novel that haunts me daily because I think to myself, what would we do as a father And as a husband and as a neighbor, if Edmonton, for example, where we live, in Old Strathcona, what would we do if we lost cell service? What would we do if we lost power? And nobody had any answers. How long would you last in your home with what you have in your fridge, what you have in your cupboards? How long before the looting? How long before the guns? How long before the full human horror of what we're capable of doing to one another when we're scared? It's The Moon of Crusted Snow by Wabgishig Rice. I love it. I'm terrified of it. I'm in awe of Wabgishig for writing it. I thank him because it is the ultimate what-if novel. Masi Cho, thanks for listening.
The one and only Richard Van Camp. His book pick for your reading list is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgishig Rice. You can check out our entire fall book pick list on our site, cbc.ca/unreserved. It's almost 2 years after her father's death, and Hazel Ellis has not reconciled her grief. She returns home to Spirit Bear Point First Nation and soon starts to have visions of an old crow. Nana Bush, or Trickster, says he's there to save her, but Hazel learns is about more than just fixing her broken heart. The quarry that's been sitting untouched for over a century is in danger of being developed by a mining company. But it just so happens to be the doorway between this world and the spirit world. Destroying it means destroying everything. That's the plot for our next book called Crow Winter. Karen McBride is an Algonquian Anishinaabe writer from the Temiskaming First Nation in Quebec, and Crow Winter is her first novel. Welcome, Karen.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Mm-hmm. So tell me, where did this story come from?
Well, it all started back in 2013 when I lost my own father to a battle with lung disease. I had a bunch of feelings, as you can imagine, just boiling up inside of me, and I didn't really know what to do with them. And writing had always been a passion of mine, so I figured, hey, maybe I should put these two things together. And eventually, after finishing my undergrad, going to teachers college, teaching for a year, and realizing that wasn't the right path for me, I applied to grad school at U of T and luckily got in and started writing Crow Winter there. It was my thesis during that time, and it just became this beautiful avenue for me to get my own grief written down on the page and ideally help someone else with theirs.
Karen, how did writing this book and the writing process itself help you work through that grief over your father's death?
Well, I think a lot of the writing process is born out of reading. So when I really came to the realization that I should write this all down, I was reading Harry Potter. As you do. And it was in the 5th book, and Harry experiences loss in a really intense way in that book. I was reading it, and it's like my grief was written on that page in somebody else's words, and it just stood out to me in such a way that I could just reached out and it grabbed me. And it's made me realize that maybe I could do this too. So writing became this way to let those feelings leave my body. It becomes therapy, except you don't have someone always asking the questions to help you get to the realization. You sort of have to get there on your own. The writing process was so important to healing myself, but hopefully to healing others too.
We're going to talk a bit more about the book, but first let's hear a little. This is Karen McBride reading from Crow Winter.
Raven was always the one the elders and other storytellers told us about. Tales of how he stole Crow's potlatch, how he made that proud bird sing and sing and sing until his voice was nothing but a croak, all the while Raven gorged himself on food. How he'd created the world and then messed it up. A trickster and a transformer. A herald of change, sometimes by accident and sometimes on purpose. A writer who only ever uses ink, who thinks that using pencil means admitting mistakes. And yet I know why it couldn't ever have been Raven. He doesn't belong to us. The Indians of Spirit Bear Point don't tell stories about Kokagi. Sure, I can smirk knowingly when I hear people talk about him here and there, but he's not mine. Me and Raven, we're different beasts. Hell, me and Raven aren't even the same kind of Indian. We aren't even neighbors. Something like 3,000 kilometers separates us. No, it could never have been Raven.
That was author Karen McBride reading from her debut novel, Crow Winter. So for those who don't know, who is Nanabush?
Nanabush is our trickster figure. He's the Algonquin Anishinaabe trickster. He's kind of like Raven, but maybe not as put together, I guess you could say.
What do you mean by that?
I think he feels younger to me sometimes, like maybe it's because we don't know as much about him as we might know about Raven because he's had a little bit more screen time, we could say, or airtime. Yeah, so Nanabush, he's, in this story, he's a little bit of a hot mess, I think.
Yeah. He might be a little bitter, but...
Yeah, a little bit.
So why did you want to write this story around the trickster figure?
Well, at first I wasn't quite sure if the trickster was going to play a role in the book at all. I knew at first that it was like, okay, this is Hazel's story, but then he kind of just snuck in. I think that's just the trickster way. Yeah. They want their stories told and they'll find their way into your book. So with the title being Crow Winter, I was like, oh, well, a crow would be great. I would love to have a crow in there, but he can't just be like, a normal bird that shows up in the background every now and then. And then Nanabush sort of just snuck into the story, and I knew he'd be the one to get Hazel out of her shell and sort of push her into those more magical and quite intense geopolitical things.
They tend to do that, those trickster figures.
They do.
And this book is more than just a trickster story. As you said, it was a way for you to deal with your grief. And it's about that grief and about loss and healing and transformation. What did you want to say about that journey?
I think really when I went through that whole process, I realized that every single feeling that came up, whether it was sad, anger, or frustration, or anything, that the whole mix that you get when you're going through that process, that it's okay to feel those things and that there's no real script for how you deal with grief. And I wanted to sort of show that with Hazel and like how she lives in her memories at times and how that can be good. It can be bad too, but you learn how to sort of like reapproach your memories. Because when you lose somebody, sometimes thinking back, it just starts to hurt. Everything becomes colored by that sadness and that grief. And for Hazel, she is very much dealing with that. But slowly she realizes by living in those memories, quite literally sometimes, there's still beauty and happiness in them, and that remembering someone you've lost doesn't mean that it's only ever going to break your heart. And it was important that I put that down and show that journey for Hazel and for other people who are going through that same thing.
You also use language in the book. There's words for different family members, greetings, common words that we often use as Indigenous people. But there's also a really in-depth, really beautiful description of the 7 grandfathers, and those being not necessarily in this order: love, respect, bravery, wisdom, humility, honesty, and truth. And for those words, you use Anishinaabe. Why was it important to use language in this way?
I think it's important that we give it space. The language for so long has been oppressed across the country in different ways and throughout the history of this nation. So it was important that I let the Anishinaabe have somewhere to live and to breathe and to be seen. So even though I think I mentioned it in my little note on language at the back that like it might not be correct the way I use it and my spelling might be all over the place, but it's there and it's present and ready to be heard. So it's sort of like this reclaiming of a piece of ourselves that was taken.
There's also a lot of imagery here about doorways and that space between the doorways, and both Hazel and Nanabush are able to travel between the doorways. They kind of stand between the worlds in both, but not really in either. Is this sort of a reflection about how you feel as an Indigenous woman living in Canada today?
I think so. I mean, we're always trying to redefine what it means to be Indigenous in the places that we are now. So I find that being stuck in between in that same way that Hazel and Nanabush are is quite the representation of what it means to be Indigenous now, and that you're, on the one hand, trying to connect with who you are on the reserve, and then also who you are outside of that is different. And it's almost like we're always playing this sort of guessing game on, how we should act or react to things. There isn't just one script or one way to be an Indigenous person. And I think Hazel comes to that realization as she sort of accepts that she can be of more than just one place.
There's a lot of books coming out by Indigenous writers about our versions of the supernatural. I'm thinking about Cherie Demeline, Eden Robinson, and Richard Van Camp. They all sort of explore this in-between place. Why do you think we're seeing this rise in this genre?
I think it's our way of taking our stories back and telling them on our own terms. And also creating this set of mythology within the Indigenous literature canon, you could say, is so important, I think, for all readers, but especially Indigenous readers, to pick up a book and say, oh my gosh, my story is so cool. Look at this amazing stuff that we have. And it can sort of stir that desire to go back and learn more about themselves as an Indigenous person. And I think it's just fantastic to see us take our own stories and to play with them and sort of continue that idea of oral tradition, that these are living and breathing stories. So we're just giving them new life by telling these stories.
Saying we're still here and we're still telling stories.
Yeah, and look how cool they are.
Look how awesome.
Yeah.
So what do you hope readers will take away from reading Crow Winter?
Well, I hope it can shine a light on the positivity and the beauty that lies within our Indigenous lives, that we aren't just this one trauma that Canada seems to like to tell about us, that we have stories that don't have to be about what we see in the news. Yes, there are horrible things happening to us, and it's difficult and it is a struggle every single day, but that there is light and there's so much beauty in our stories, whether that's on the reserve or out in the communities at large. I mean, we have so much to be happy about and to showcase that we are human. At the core of it, this is a human story that happens to be about an Indigenous girl. So hopefully readers can pick it up and say, wow, you know what? There's so much here. And I'm excited to learn more.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Karen McBride is the author of Crow Winter. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today we're picking books to add to your fall reading list, and we're getting help from Indigenous authors. Let's see who's got our next book pick.
Hi, I'm Alicia Elliott from Six Nations of the Grand River, Tuscarora Nation. My book is called A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, and it's a book of essays looking at the ways that colonialism and inherited legacies of trauma impact us in the present moment. A book I'd recommend is Gwen Benaway's Holy Wild, which is a phenomenal book of poetry looking at the ways that trans Indigenous woman's life is impacted on multiple levels by dehumanization and how we can create love and beauty in those moments despite everything.
A book pick from Alicia Elliott. Her choice is Holy Wild by Gwen Benaway. You can take a look at her fall book pick list on our website. That's at cbc.ca/unreserved. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, talking all about books on the show today because I am that Indigenerd. It's been called an Indigenous version of the Hardy Boys, Michael Hutchinson's Mighty Muskrats Mystery Series. Say that 10 times fast. Follows 4 cousins who help solve mysteries on their reserve, the Windy Lake First Nation. Michael is Cree from the Mispaistic Cree Nation, and he joins us now from Ottawa. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
So why is this book being called the Indigenous version of the Hardy Boys?
The Mighty Muskrats are 4 cousins who basically go around their reserve. Their uncle is a local band constable, and their grandpa is a respected elder in the community. And so they hear about a lot of the gossip that's going on, and like any community, things happen, and the Mighty Muskrats are always there to get to the bottom of the case.
Now, the story weaves a lot of cultural significance into the adventures. Why was it important to include that?
There's a couple of things I guess I'm trying to do with the book. The first thing I want to do is make make kids feel capable. I grew up probably not like everybody did. Like my dad didn't like TV, and we used horses a lot to do things, and we canoed and spent time out in the bush and on the farm. And so we did a lot of things that I think city kids would think like, wow, kids did that. Kids were even allowed to do that. And so kids are capable and can do a lot. One of the young muskrats, Otter, goes for a long canoe ride. And, that was things that we can do and are safe to do if kids take precautions and know what they're doing. So making kids feel capable is one. I also wanted to let First Nation kids hear themselves as First Nation people. There's not a lot of media out there that actually speaks to us. So I wanted to have that First Nation voice in there so that when First Nation kids read the book, it reflected their community, it reflected the people that they know. And then I guess I also want to educate Canadians, their youth, about our situation in our community and the fact that First Nation people all think differently. In their community, while they're solving their cases, the mighty muskrats come across many different ideas, many different differences in opinions from the people that live near Windy Lake or extracting resources from the land, all that kind of stuff. And so you hear different First Nation opinions on different issues.
There's also some subtle nods to Cree ways of life and thinking that might be glossed over by the average reader, but would be highly relatable to those who grew up in the culture. How intentional was that?
Well, I'm a Cree person, and so I want to be able to, reflect my culture, I guess. But, you kind of do that stuff automatically, I guess, when you're an author and you're just pulling stuff out of you. You use your own aunties, you use your own uncles, you use, the people that from back home. Within your stories, and so that just kind of comes out, I guess, from being who I is.
Who you is. How much of your experiences is in the book?
Well, I guess I grew up north. I didn't live on my res, but I lived across the river from my res. I've also, I've been the host of APTN National News for 7 years, and also worked for many Indigenous organizations. So I've visited many First Nations across the country. And so, there's a little bit of all that in there. I've seen things like there's a establishment on Windy Lake called the House-Durant. That wasn't on my First Nation, but I went to a First Nation where a lady had basically moved into her basement and turned her first floor into a restaurant. This is things that happen in northern communities where you can't rent business space, so people do what they do, and they're going to make business, and they're going to make money to feed their families.
There's quite a bit of res humor in the book, and I'm doing air quotes there. Even some of the characters keep it light while they're looking for a missing person. What role does humor play in Cree culture?
Well, I think personally that Cree people are the funniest Indians.
Heck yeah.
And one of the reasons I believe that is because of the environment that we lived in. Very harsh back in the old days, and the building blocks of our nations are families, not individuals. And so it was very important that, if you wanted to survive through a Manitoba winter, that you got to stay inside the teepee or the wigwam. And if you were a jerk, there's a good chance that you wouldn't be able to spend the whole winter inside the teepee, and you'd probably end up dying. So it was in everybody's benefit to sort of blunt the harsh edges, to make certain that our words and our meanings were not sharp and pointed and directed exactly at somebody. And so this is why we used humor. Cree people tease. An elder won't tell you what they think you're doing wrong, but they might tease you about something close by it. And I think humor is a big part of who we are as First Nation people, all across the country. And we're funny people.
We certainly are. Now, the book has been out since March, and you've heard from a few First Nation educators who've been interested in developing curricula around it. How has that conversation been for you?
Well, it's pretty neat. Like I said, I'm hoping to do a series. Each one, they're written for 7 to 12-year-olds. But I think, I've had some adult readers say, it was interesting. It kept me entertained throughout the whole thing. So I'm hoping that curriculum can be based around them. The second book, for example, The Case of the Missing Auntie, the muskrats pay a visit to the Truth and Reconciliation Center in Winnipeg. And so they talk about the 60s scoop. They talk about, residential schools, and they talk about that history. And then the secondary story of the young men and that sort of stuff sort of kind of in some way shows the fallout of some of those things. So I'm trying to take harsh topics and sometimes difficult topics and boil them down in a way that we can explain them to 7 and 12-year-olds and make them interesting. Not an easy thing to do, but I think it's worth it. And I think that it's important for the relationship of between First Nations and Canadians going into the next 150 years.
Very well put. Thank you so much for your time, Michael.
All right. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to tell everybody about the mighty muskrat.
That's Michael Hutchinson. He's the author of The Case of Windy Lake, which is out on Second Story Press now. His second book, The Case of the Missing Auntie, will be out early next year. Remember, you can find a list of all the books we featured on the show today on our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. And we've got one more to add to that list. Here's our final author book pick.
Hi, my name is Harold Johnson. My book is Peace and Good Order. It's about my experience after 20 years in the justice system. The book I would recommend is Eden Robinson's Trickster Trilogy because it contains real magic.
Well, you can't argue with real magic. Author Harold Johnson's book pick was for the Trickster series by Eden Robinson. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at unreserved@cbc.ca or find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Ayose.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.